Well, people may join in as time goes on, but I will extend a welcome to everyone or welcome back if you've come to a few of these before. I hope you're looking forward to this discussion because this one was actually inspired by you. I was asked a couple of times about artificial sweeteners, non-nutritive sweeteners, and it inspired me to look into it because they really are everywhere. And I figured this was an excellent chance for me to get even more updated on the research because it changes constantly, and wanted to make sure I could share with all of you what I've learned and over time and where we stand right now. So the title, of course, is Sweet Choices: Sugar versus Artificial Sweeteners and Their Impact on Health. And as I like to say for the mantra, remember the quality of your calories, and in this case, maybe your non-calories matters. Always important to keep in mind. So what we'll cover today, and I'm going to try and keep this pretty well in order, although it's very easy to get into the weeds. Again, these types of sweeteners have been around for a while, and the research has been also ongoing, and which is important, but it's always hard to sort of stay updated, and it's easy to get lost in the weeds. And by the way, I have a cat with me, so he will come through the screen if you see a tail. I also have a couple of sides that I might speak on as depending on if time allows, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So anyhow, we'll do a quick history. When and why did we start using artificial or non-nutritive sweeteners? And the reason why I am being sort of specific there, and I'll probably go around interchanging the words, but essentially not all of the sweeteners that we use that don't have calories, they're not all artificial. Some of them exist naturally. You can think of stevia or monk fruit as a couple of examples, and even some of the sugar alcohols. And this guy is trying to get comfortable here, apparently. So that's why I sort of exchange them. But yes, they're not all artificial. There are some that you could consider natural. And so non-nutritive essentially covers all the bases, or sugar substitutes because it's a little easier to say. I will also touch on what are some of the sugar substitutes that are on the market today, but we won't get to all of them because there are quite a few. What the science says about sugar, because it's important that we touch on that, and also what the science says about non-nutritive sweeteners. Also, is there a showdown? Do we have a clear winner between one or the two? Is one way worse than the other? And it's an interesting sort of conclusion that I think I've come to at the moment. I also have a challenge to issue to some of you if you feel like accepting it. So stay tuned for that. And of course, as always, at the end will be open time for you to ask your questions. For anybody who is new here, of course, the question Q&A button is, I believe, at the bottom left of your screen. You can choose to be anonymous if you don't want your name said out loud, because I'll most likely say goodness. I hope everyone is still with me. I don't know quite what happened, but here we go. I'll go back one screen because I was not expecting that. Okay, anyway, when we get to the Q&A, feel free to be anonymous or have your name listed. I'll mention your name if you do have your name listed there. And by the way, even if your question isn't related to the topic tonight, feel free to ask it. I'm happy to answer any nutrition related question or anything that might be on your mind. All right, so let's get started. All right, a brief history of artificial sweeteners. So I was actually surprised about this. I was trying to just find out when the very first artificial sweetener was created, but really we can all go all the way back to ancient Rome, where they used sugar of lead, or I guess more scientifically known lead acetate, was used to sweeten wine. And of course, at the time, they didn't realize what kind of harm that could cause, but thankfully we don't use that one anymore. In more recent time, the very first artificial sweetener was created in 1879, and that was saccharin. It was actually created in a lab in Johns Hopkins, and it became popular during World War I because of the scarcity of sugar. Then later in the 60s and 70s for dieting purposes. So it was the fashion at the time. After that, after saccharin made its big splash, from the 1960s to today, it's really had a sort of taken off in terms of just multiple different versions, types being created, and also the search for the best one seems to be out there. So we've got artificial sweeteners as well as plant-based sweeteners. Also, there's sugar alcohols, which are on the market, and of course, they're all known as non-nutritive sweeteners. Currently, they're popular for dental health. You'll see, I believe it's sorbitol in many of the toothpastes or in sugar-free gums because it helps prevent cavities and adds a nice flavor to the toothpaste. But it's also popular for diet or blood sugar control. And finally, there is a level of cost savings. Sugar is not cheap, and there are some, but not all, sweeteners that are cheaper to use and create. I guess probably the best example, I'm trying to think here, probably, some of the saccharins and aspartames you're going to be seeing. So by any other name, so a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. A sweetener by any other name will taste actually generally sweeter than sugar. They're designed that way. They're multiple hundreds of times sweeter generally. But I wanted to list out the names of some pretty common sweeteners that you might come across. And also, if they come in a packet, I wanted to name the color of the packet that you're most likely to see it in. So aspartame, you would know as NutraSweet or Equal, so it's the blue packet. Sucralose is Splenda, and yellow, which is yellow. Asulfame potassium or asulfame K, they do have a brand name of Sweet One or Sonnet. I have never actually seen that on the market. So recognizing that packet color isn't quite so common. Saccharin, of course, is Sweet and Low, so the pink packet. Then stevia, steviol glycosides, which there's multiple brand names, but there are a few here. That comes in the green. And then one of the more recent ones, monk fruit, which I'm not sure of many trade names right now. I suppose monk fruit in the raw is one that you could go by, but that's more of an orangey, not quite yellow color packet. There are also sugar alcohols, and this is sort of where we get into the chemistry, and I won't do too deep of a dive into chemistry because I'm not a food scientist, but essentially sugar alcohols, the reason why they're called alcohols is the chemical structure. It has nothing to do with intoxication or anything like that, but the names that you will see, they'll all end in OL, so sorbitol, xylitol, mannitol, and erythritol. I'm sure you've seen those on, especially usually the diabetic candies, or I once referenced the sugar-free gummy bears that people reviewed on Amazon and talking about all the GI issues that they had with that. So those are usually the sugar alcohols where you will find them. And then finally, again, this is not a comprehensive list, but there are a few other non-nutritive sweeteners out there. There's one called Advantame, and a new plant-derived one, which seems like it will be on the market, or maybe you have run across it yourself. I haven't seen it, but I don't even really know how to pronounce it, but thaumatin. There's also allulose, which has been used in a couple candies where it imparts sweetness, but not calories, which is really interesting. Then there's also neotame and one called cyclamate, which is actually not available in the US, but available in, I believe, over 100 countries. So the reason why that one's banned, I couldn't quite find a valid reason, but I think we're flush with enough other sweeteners that we're not really lacking. We'll get back onto the sweeteners, but it's important to also talk about sugar because we are comparing the two. So is it all bad? Well, first I wanted to mention, what are added sugars? Because we do talk about added sugars and that being sort of the problem. And those are any sugars that get added to a food during processing. And so that includes syrups or honey. Sometimes people don't think about that. Molasses or concentrated fruit juices, high fructose corn syrup, which most people would know, and table sugar. So even if it is a naturally occurring type of sugar, if it is not naturally occurring in the food that you're putting it in, then it essentially becomes an added sugar. And added sugars are associated with the risk of several non-communicable diseases, according to many articles, but this one was a reference from the New England Journal of Medicine. So cardiometabolic diseases, type 2 diabetes, and also an association with generalized inflammation in the body, which can lead to disease states and can also lead to obesity. And so we've established that. And also, this is where I'll go on a little bit of a tangent here. Added sugars seemed to really rise in the 80s and the 90s when we were going through that fat-free craze. I'm sure you remember when everything was fat-free. You had to have 0% fat and all of this. But when you remove fat from food, the food generally becomes less good. It becomes gross, to be honest. And so fat equals flavor. And the way that they were going to help make up for that was generally to add sugar. So the translation of fat-free oftentimes meant added sugar to try and add something there. And a lot of times I will tell people, yes, we had the fat-free craze, but look where that got us. It really didn't give us many advantages, and people didn't get any healthier because they went fat-free. And we've realized that fat isn't quite the devil we made it out to be. Interestingly enough, the research articles that went to blame fat, after a little bit of investigation, seem to be funded a lot by the sugar industry to fund the scientists to essentially find fault with fat. So there's always that follow the money phrase that you can use sometimes with seeing how certain people get influenced and how the research can sometimes come out. So it's always good to know if there's financial stakes in some of the information we get. But anyhow, we have established that sugar wasn't the answer to our prayers. It's more about what types of fats and the quality of the fats that we're getting in. So in order to make sure that we're taking care of the amount of sugar we're consuming, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans recommends that less than 10% of your calories should come from added sugars after the age of 2. So if you had a 2,000 calorie diet, that would be 200 calories would be from sugar. And recently, based on some reviews, over 50% of adults exceed that recommendation. And unfortunately, over 70% of children and adolescents. A lot of times, these added sugars come in the form of sugar-sweetened beverages, which I'm sure is no surprise. Many people can remember growing up with a Coke or Pepsi in the afternoons, or maybe I know at my middle school, there was a Coke day if everybody did really well with their grades. And that was the day everybody looked forward to. The American Heart Association also wanted to put in their input in terms of added sugars, and they were a bit stricter than the dietary guidelines. And so they made this infographic where it talks about, for men, no more than 9 teaspoons or 36 grams or 150 calories. And I really appreciate that they spell it out like that. And then for women, life's not fair. We end up having a little less. They recommend no more than 6 teaspoons or 25 grams or 100 calories of added sugars. So again, these are added, not like if you were going to eat a piece of fruit. Still important to be careful, but they're not talking about fruit or anything like that. So this is the comparison between the old food label and the new, because I wanted to demonstrate how, since we are paying attention to added sugars now, they've actually adjusted the food label, not just for that, but they've included added sugars now. And so the nutrition facts label was changed in 2016, and all manufacturers were required to use the new label by July 1st of 2021. So these aren't all of the changes, but among those is that the percent daily value has been updated because we've updated the newer, like we've established new daily values for vitamins and minerals. That being said, they do have a daily value listed for added sugars, which I don't really agree with, because I feel like daily value means that it's something that we're trying to reach 100% of. And there is no goal level of added sugar. We could live perfectly fine without any added sugars. So I wish they didn't have that. It's more like 20 on the right-hand side. You can see it's basically reaching 20% of the maximum amount they would recommend is how to interpret that one. Also, just for your general information, vitamins A and C are no longer required on the label. So you can see in that bottom little portion, they used to have vitamin A and C, but vitamins D and potassium were added. Those are nutrients of concern, and so they wanted to include those. Also, the calories from fat were removed, which I think was a good idea because that's really not that important. It's more, where are you getting the fats from? Are you getting them from trans fats, which we want to avoid? Saturated fats, you don't necessarily have to avoid, but be mindful of that. And are you getting any unsaturated fats? And as I mentioned, added sugars are now required. And so the way this breaks down, and they didn't name what kind of container this is from, but essentially you've got total sugars of 12 grams and then 10 grams of added sugars. So the 2 grams that are missing are essentially the naturally occurring sugars. You could also see an example of this if you have if you have white milk in your refrigerator and you look at what it has. Regular white milk will not have added sugars, but it does have lactose, unless you have a lactose-free milk. So the lactose, because it ends in OSE, that means sugar. And so it's not particularly sweet, but it is a sugar. And so they do list it, which can be a bit confusing, but that's just for you to know. So we touched on the sugars and what the problems with those can be, but does that mean sweeteners are any better? And one of the most interesting pieces of evidence that comes back, where I guess you can't say it's actively harmful, but it's not helpful in the way we thought, is that there's no evidence that using non-nutritive sweeteners help with weight loss in any way. And I'll touch on this more in a little bit, but basically it seems like you can have something with sugar, you can have something that has no sugar. You're not going to notice your weight be affected necessarily by making that one change, right? Of course, there are exceptions to this, but in general, and in fact, the World Health Organization has even recommended don't use sugar-free substitutes, or sugar substitutes as your weight loss tool. It can be a tool in other ways, but don't use it just for that. Also, as research continues, there is concern about the association that they have with other negative health outcomes like type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease, obesity, and all-cause mortality, which essentially means any cause of death within a certain time frame. The issue with this, and I think probably the most frustrating thing with all of this, is we still don't know why this might be the case. One large reason for this is that doing research that involves especially food is very, very difficult to do, where you have enough control to know exactly what is the factor that's affecting someone's health. So we're trying to tune into it, but that's one of the reasons why it's very hard to pick it out, because you can't just see a trend and say, well, it was that, when it could be for a variety of factors, for how the person lived or what else they might be eating or what their lifestyle might be. But we're getting a few clues. So there are some newer pieces of research. which I'll touch on the little graphic on the left. That's actually from a review article in the New England Journal of Medicine from 2023 that had some very provocative pieces of information. But first I'll talk about what I've listed here. So some possible reasons that they might be impacting our health is that some of these artificial sweeteners seem to change the bacteria in our gut. And we are noticing more and more that the gut and our brain, they communicate, and the bacteria also seem to have an influence on this. And so if the bacteria and the microbiome change in any significant amount, that could affect how we're going to metabolize, or how we're going to be, whether or not we're going to feel hunger faster. And so there could be a whole variety of issues that arise from that, again, we're still learning. There's also this hypothesis of energy compensation. So basically, you could imagine that many of us think, if I drink, if I choose Diet Pepsi instead of regular Pepsi, I'm saving 200 calories. That's wonderful. Shave off 200 calories. I should be good. I'm at a calorie deficit. But for whatever reason, there's no real calories that end up getting saved because we seem to make up for it in other ways. What seems to happen is that our body interprets that sweetness as actual calories coming in, and then there gets to be some confusion again with some of these hormones responding as though we had sugar, but then we don't, and causes mass confusion. And so then we make up for those calories with other foods that we eat throughout the day. And unless we're being very careful or paying attention, probably wouldn't even notice it. So that's the paradoxical issue as to why, for somebody who's working to lose weight, how is cutting calories out from drinks or anything like that, how are we not losing weight? And no doubt maybe one of you or some of you have experienced that kind of frustration, thinking I've made this change but I don't see anything. Also, sweet flavors increases the preference for more sweet flavor. So if you like sweet and you eat sweets, you tend to want more sweets. It's almost sort of like a snowball effect. And so even though we're going calorie free, there might be this desire to eat a little more dessert in that evening, or have something that is an extra portion of something that's sweet. And so it's, again, building into that snowball effect. And then finally, there's a possible correlation with xylitol as well as erythritol and blood clot formation, which that surprised me. That was a new piece of information I hadn't read about before. I think the only reason that it didn't go out to massive amounts of news stations, because normally that gets people's attention, is that the sample sizes were pretty small and they still haven't proven that is causing, where you can see actually this is shown in the graphic on the far right. They talk about the stroke or a heart attack or ultimately death, because of course blood clots could lead to those issues. But again, we have to still find out, is it the erythritol that's leading to all of that? But based on the review article and what they're seeing, that's rather interesting. And again, I'm not going to read this whole thing out here, but it is an interesting little review. But I will mention that they also looked at sucralose, so Splenda, and also saccharin, which is, our old friend there from the 1870s. And sucralose had some interesting responses as well, because while it almost had an immune affecting response, so there would be tumors that would start growing in these mice. This was only tested in mice, but there would be tumors that would start growing in them. However, if they had some sort of immune system issue, or say that their pancreas was being attacked by immune cells, which would lead to type 1 diabetes, sucralose seemed to help prevent that. So it was a very unusual set of circumstances, but ultimately it's really messing with the T cells, so the immune system response in mice models. Again, they haven't shown that in human models, but in mice, it was really interesting. As far as saccharin, of course, there does seem to be this response with, if they test people with glucose after eating something or drinking something with saccharin, seems that blood sugars want to go a bit higher, which isn't exactly the aim, not what we're going for. And as they mentioned here with the microbiota, it does seem to, again, change the gut bacteria. So all very interesting, but nothing that proves anything. It would be very easy to get excited about this, but we don't have enough information to say, yes, this is a problem. By the way, I will mention that xylitol does tend to be toxic for dogs. So you do want to avoid, if you have a dog, make sure they stay out of anything that might contain that. So who wins? So regardless of what you pick, sugar or a non-nutritive sweetener, my phrase for things like this is the portion makes the poison. So any of these in too great of amounts could be problematic. And remember, and this is again where we see research and what correlates, what's actually the cause. The use of these sweeteners increased around the same time as convenience and ultra-processed foods increased. So it's hard to pin down who's going to get the most blame out of some of these ill effects that we're seeing. If you have diabetes, if you're weighing the options between high fructose corn syrup drink or a regular sugared soda and sugar-free, or really anything else with sugar versus sugar-free, in general, sugar-free is going to win because we don't want to see your blood sugars going very, very high by drinking something like that. And you may ask, what do I do? Because I think it's important that you know what would the dietitian do in my real life. And so I will have an occasional soda. I'm not going to deny that. However, I cannot bring myself to do anything other than a diet drink. The idea of drinking actual sugar or high fructose corn syrup it's something that triggers a visceral response to me that I just can't bring myself to do that. I consider the diet version to be safer because also soda is a treat. I don't sit down. It's not the thing that I drink with meals. I opt for water or sparkling water or coffee throughout the day, generally. Most people will see me with a cup of coffee and a sparkling water every morning. So I'm usually got one in each hand. And if I'm given the choice, I choose monk fruit or stevia because I think that the closer that we can get to the plant or an animal, the better. And I agree with this in terms of non-nutritive sweeteners as well. And I think in general, we would all benefit from limiting our intake of both types, whether we have sugar versus sugar substitutes, as much as possible. And again, another quick aside as to why I think this is important, this has also to do with the enjoying sweet encourages more sweet intake, is that this isn't my story, it's a story of from another dietitian, but she was working with a mother and baby, and the baby was 9 months old, but 45 pounds, which is not the weight that you would typically see for a 9-month-old. And the 9-month-old was unable to really reach those stages that you would expect. Walking was difficult. And so they were trying to figure out what caused this, what led to this gain of weight. And what happened was the mother tasted the formula that she'd been feeding her infant, and she found it to not taste good at all. It really doesn't have much flavor. And she started adding strawberry syrup to it. And after that, her child would not go back to unflavored formula because he or she got used to the sweetened taste. And so it can start from very young that we get used to a certain flavor and we want to continue to go after that flavor. So the challenge, if you choose to accept it, to maybe get away from some of this, because it is not easy to do, is something called the No Added Sugar Challenge. You certainly don't have to, but just so you know, I have tested this on myself because I'm not going to suggest that someone try something that I couldn't do. And it wasn't easy, especially the first 2 weeks, but this is a way that really can essentially break that desire for sweet. And I'll be honest, I was shocked at how effective it really was in the end. I remember not being interested in wedding cake because I actually had to attend a wedding after a month of doing this, and I couldn't have been less interested. So the no added sugar challenge, weeks 1 and 2, keep it very simple. And this was inspired by another dietitian where she just got rid of everything for a whole month, but I do it broken down. So no desserts or sweets of any kind, no added sugar drinks, and no fruit juices. Then and once you've gotten through those 2 weeks, moving on to week 3, no sugar substitutes and no refined carbohydrate foods. So white bread, white pasta. I know white rice isn't all that refined, but you get the idea. And then week 4, no sweet condiments like Catalina or poppy seed dressings, sweet barbecue sauce. And if you're eating from a packaged food, and this applies even if you're not doing this challenge, I think this is a great thing, is choose those that pass the Altman rule or have 2 grams of sugar or less per serving. So if you are looking at a food label, you want to add the grams of fiber plus the grams of protein. And if together that is more than the grams of sugar, then it passes. And of course, you want the fiber to be minimum of 3 grams, if at all possible, per serving. And now here's your time to shine. Thank you if you've made it this far. I know I went a bit long-winded, but I hope you found it informative. Does anyone have any questions? I welcome any and all. Oh, here we go. Maria, what about coconut sugar? That's a great question. And if you can believe it, I actually looked it up right before we started because I thought this would be a question. From what I can tell, it's using usually a syrup. And there is, as far as I can tell, and I will correct myself if I'm wrong, but it looks like it's still going to be an added type of sugar. It does seem to have calories. If you like the flavor, then, that's a great way to go, but it's certainly not non-nutritive. So there is a sweetener effect to that. And I believe it would have about the same level of calories. Of course, now I want to check myself. But I do think it tastes pretty good. Let's see, does anyone else have any questions? Oh, you're very welcome, Maria. Oh, yes, the fiber protein rule. Absolutely, and I'll even show you the example. I can't tell if my camera goes backward, if you see backwards or not, because I was going to show an example off of a box of some muesli that I have, but just in case. So, what you want, I have this pulled up here. You want that the total, if you have dietary fiber, 4 grams here from this food label, and protein 3. So fiber, you want it to be at least 3 grams or more of fiber per serving. And adding this with the grams of protein per serving doesn't mean you have to eat the whole serving. You can do less or more. But 4 plus 3, 5, 6, 7, you've got 7 grams there. And then they actually indicate total sugars versus added sugars here. I guess it can depend on a few things, but we can look at total sugars or added. It really doesn't make a difference in this case. 7 is not greater than 12. So this would not be, whatever this is, would not be an ideal choice. But yes, so it has to be grams of fiber plus grams of protein need to be greater than the total grams of sugar. And I can also go back to that spot so you can see at the bottom here. I think it's a really great rule to follow. I know some people have some other rules that they like to use, but probably one of my favorites. So yes, thank you, Kim. Are there any other questions? See if I can find something that's popped up. When choosing dairy products, is fat-free a good choice? This is hotly debated, and I'll say, depending on the dietitian, you might get a completely different answer. I used to be fat-free all the way because that's when I was in college, we were still in the fat-free ways. But I actually think at least 1%, maybe 2% would be ideal, simply because that fat does equal a little bit of fullness. It can be individual, sometimes fat-free works out, but I would recommend at least 1 or 2%. And every morning I have yogurt and I do a full fat, and I think that's probably the better way to go because it also helps control some blood sugars. But that is a great question. So thank you, Kimberly. And are there any other questions? Of course, if you have questions that you think of later, or if you have concerns or any other commentary, by all means, you can always reach out to the Premier Weight Loss group because they are always more than happy to reach out to me and let me know. But I really hope you enjoyed all of this, and if you do have any questions or concerns later, just let us know. But that probably concludes it unless anybody has more questions, but I hope you, oh, yes. So we should limit diet sodas per week. Any recommendations, Kimberly? Great question, and I'm glad you put that in there. The way I like to work on this is essentially for anyone, because it's sometimes hard to go cold turkey. If you're someone who works well with cold turkey, then do it by all means. But I would say cutting it in half. So if you drink 2 diet sodas a day, go to 1 diet soda a day. If you drink 1 diet soda a day, then try and go to every other day. And finding something that's working for you in between is hard. Some people drink diet sodas for the caffeine content and because they don't like coffee, and tea doesn't always work. So then it's also about cutting back so that you don't have any caffeine headaches. But what I would say is try and cut in half if the cold turkey might be difficult. I know it can be difficult for me, but try and cut it in half and then a half again, because that way you can sort of still enjoy it, and eventually it can become an occasional treat, but it's not the default drink, if you will. And you're very welcome. I'm glad that I really appreciate these questions. I think they're really important because they are a part of our lives. Other than that, I don't have any more open questions. So I leave it like this, but if there are no others, I hope that you have a warm-ish evening and stay safe out there, and hopefully your drive, if you have to drive anywhere tonight or tomorrow, that it's safe. And thank you again so much. This was a wonderful evening. So have a lovely evening.